Hello, everyone. This is a short video to introduce the Book of Psalms as poetry. You have already read the chapter from Brown and have worked on Moodle on the different kinds of parallelisms and also the metaphors. So this video is in some ways trying to recap some of those ideas and also walk through the different parallelisms. I hope you compare them with your own answers to that quiz. Just to clarify, that quiz does not go towards your final grade. It's just a way of me setting it up so that each one of you would work on their own. And now I will walk you through some of those examples. So a few things I would like to highlight from the chapter by Brown, and I will post this PowerPoint as well. So Psalms as poetry, two important aspects as you interpret the book of Psalms we're exploring thus far. One is figuring out parallelisms, how the first part of the line relates to the second part of the line, and also metaphors. What are metaphors? What are the metaphors used for God, for humans, and how can we interpret them in a way that is important and significant for understanding the psalm that we are working with? So, poetry, in a very brief way, is the kind of thing poets write. And I find this really interesting, funny, witty definition of poetry, because it's like, what is theology? Theology is the thing that theologians write, and so on. But I think the reason this is an interesting definition is that then it opens up the definition of poetry and what poetry is. And Brown talks about three characteristics of poetry. It's artistic, so it doesn't just say the idea in an abstract way, but it gives it a little bit of aesthetic and artistic way of expressing it. And it's not just decoration, but it actually, this artistic aspect gives it power. And therefore, many people who enjoy poetry find it to be very powerful than just simple prose. Poetry is usually compact, so it tries to say what it wants to say in a very succinct and terse way. Poetry has also a performative power. It animates the world before its readers and its audience. The art of reading poetry is to find oneself moving inside the growing poem. So in some ways, you are trying to transfer yourself into the world of the poem itself, into the world of the psalm, and trying to follow the lead within the psalm itself on how the psalm is unfolding. So one of the skills that we will be working on is finding a structure to each psalm and finding repeated words and rhythms and movement of the poem itself. There is a fine line of agency in the process of making meaning. We do not read to impose our meaning on the poem. And that means that we, in some ways, are conscious readers, but at the same time, we're aware of what we're bringing to the poem. So we're letting the poem itself take the lead. But at the same time, what we are doing is that we are not just simply trying to find meaning, although that's really important. We're trying to enjoy it. We're trying to walk into its world and let it animate the world around us. But you have, a culture, you have a language, you have a worldview, you have a theology. All of this is significant and it contributes to understanding the meaning of the text. So in some ways, we're invited to enjoy the poems. We're invited to let the poem take the lead, but we're also conscious of what we are bringing with us, and we employ critical perspective towards what we bring, but with the realization that we cannot get rid of what we are bringing with us. So reading poetry is much like writing poetry. It proceeds thoughtfully and creatively, word by word, image by image, and beat by beat. And you see here, I think what Brown is trying to get at is that this is the art of slow reading. This is the art of learning how to sit with the text. This is the art of reading the text in multiple languages, multiple translations, so that you could actually walk through it slowly. Hebrew poetry has some of its features as well. So Hebrew poetry is terse. This is common in all poetry, but even grammatically speaking, it deletes like definite article or relative pronoun or direct object marker in order to balance out the meter or balance out the rhythm within the poem itself. Hebrew poetry is different from prose in its intensity. And it's intense in the emotional aspect, and it's intense in repetition of words, images, and metaphors, and ways of talking to God and ways of expressing oneself. Hebrew poetry also can be thought of in two layers, in two aspects. So ask yourself when you're reading the Psalms, what difference would it make if this psalm was written to be seen? What difference does it make when this poem was written to be heard? What difference does it make for it to be seen? What difference does it make for it to be heard? And unfortunately, we are reading the Psalms in English or Amharic or Swahili or Arabic or Spanish. We're not reading it in Hebrew. I mean, I know Hebrew, so I can read in Hebrew. Some of you might know Hebrew, so you can do that. But there is something that we are losing because we are not reading its original language. So I, with all of my heart, encourage you to take Hebrew and Greek if you can. There is a something that is debated in biblical scholarship about meter. The different ways of dividing the Hebrew poetic line, and there is a meter. There is a way in which rhythm and beats play out in the Hebrew poetic line, but it's debated by scholars whether we have meters. Some scholars would say, yes, we have meter in Hebrew poetic line, but it's hard to always discern them because it doesn't cover all of the poem. It may cover a few lines and so on. Browns writes that the poetry of the Psalms can be at once conventional and innovative. This is a really interesting quotation here because it plays on another layer of how to interpret any literary text. When you are reading a particular text and once you say this is poetry, that means because of your experience with poetry in your language, you are bringing expectations of what poetry is. So you're trying to discern something about the genre. That's what it means for poetry to be conventional. That if there are some features to Hebrew poetry, then when you are familiar with some of these features, probably the author and the reader had some sort of an agreement in some way of, when the poet starts to write poetry, they know that their readers are expecting some things in poetry. But every poet is also a master of innovation, and therefore there is not one single psalm identical to another psalm, even though there are shared features, but they are all unique. So therefore, when we are interpreting the Psalms, we ask ourselves, what are we expecting to see in the Psalms? But we also ask ourselves, how is this Psalm unique? How is this Psalm different? What kind of innovation happened and took place here? Hebrew poetry has a feature called the acrostics. This doesn't happen all over the place, but some psalms like 25, 34, 11, and so on, they follow the order of the Hebrew alphabet, and every line begins with the next Hebrew letter. So the first line begins with Aleph, the second line begins with Beit, Gimel, Dalet, all the way down to Tav. So scholars wondered, why do some psalms have this kind of order? Some are saying maybe for the sake of memorization. It helps to say, okay, what is the next letter? Oh, it's Dalet. So what is the word? And then they start to recite the poem. Some scholars are saying maybe this was a way of imposing a sense of order. If the psalm is trying to capture chaos in life, sickness, diseases, and oppression, they are trying to impose a sense of order on disorder by way of composing a poem that follows the order of the Hebrew alphabet. Other scholars are saying, well, all of these suggestions are cool, but maybe these poets were just doing it for the sake of pleasure. Maybe they were trying to show off. Maybe they were trying to show that they can actually write a poem that follows the order of the Hebrew alphabet. One of the key features of Hebrew poetry is parallelism, which you all have worked with during the quiz for this week. Parallelism, simply defined, a line of Hebrew poetry is made up of two parts, two parts, which may be designated A and B. So when you see a line, a Hebrew poetic line, you divide it into two parts and you ask, what is the relationship between them? What helps us to decide what are the parts of the Hebrew poetic line? Syntax. And Hebrew syntax is usually made up of verb, subject, prepositional clause, relative clause, circumstantial clause. You could still see them reflected in English translation, of course, except in English, sometimes they shift some words here and there to make them make better sense in English. Sometimes, the range of meaning of words help us. This is the semantic, help us to see what kind of relationship. Are they antithetical or are they synonyms? Sometimes listening to the Hebrew poem helps us. Sometimes seeing the words itself and knowing what kind of part of speech are these words help us decide on these poetic lines and their parts and parallelism. So the main question you are working with is, what is the relationship between these two parts of the Hebrew poetic line? Are they synonymous, saying the same thing, using different words? Are they antithetical, so saying two opposite ideas, and the third one is synthetic? Synthetic means pretty much anything else. Synthetic means that the second part could be clarification, could be an answer to a question, could be a repetition. It could be a way of trying to make an idea more concrete. James Kugel said, you know what? Synonymous, antithetic, and synthetic are great ways of talking about it, but he wants us to move more into line A, or the first part of this line is A and the second line is B, and the relationships between them are endless, because it pretty much covers the whole book of Psalms and you're trying to figure those out. Why do I care about us thinking about parallelism? Although, like, when we are reading a psalm, you don't have to like do it in every single line. Is that because in some lines, when you do this kind of analysis, it helps you to dig deeper into the meaning of the psalm. So parallelism becomes an interpretive tool. Yes, it's a way of enjoying the psalm and the poetic features of the psalm, but it's also a way of slowing us down, a way of making us think more about the relationship between the different parts of the poem. This is the second part of our exercise, which is the metaphor. And I will just go back to the document of the different parallelisms to walk you through some of the examples that you have done. So I'm not going to go every single example, but I just want to show you some examples and compare them with your results, how you answered those questions. So Psalm 24, for example, verses 1 through 3, the earth is the Lord's and all that's in it, the world and those who live in it. So you have clearly the earth and the world are parallel to each other, and all that's in it and all who live in it are parallel, synonymous. They are the same thing. The world and the earth pretty much referring to the same thing. They didn't repeat the Lord's in the second one out of just being terse and compact in its expression, and so on. So this is a synonymous. This verse throughout is synonymous. You look at verse 3, who shall ascend the hill of the Lord, and who shall stand in the holy place? The hill of the Lord has the holy place. So they are synonymous, but you could tell there is still an addition, even though they are synonymous. And that's what it means to analyze. This is what it means to break it down and start to see how it's unfolding. When Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, you have here Israel, Jacob, Egypt, and strange language. So yes, they are synonymous, but you could also see how the second line is adding something about Egypt, how they are understanding Egypt, that it's also a country where they don't speak the same language like we do, and so on. Their mischief returns upon their own heads, and their own heads their violence descends. They are synonymous, but do you see the order here? It became A, B, B prime, and A prime. This A with the apostrophe or dash on it. Their mischief goes with violence, and heads are going together. So it's A, B, B, A, kind of parallelism, but it's synonymous. It's saying the same thing, and it's adding something, but it's also probably like if you would take one statement out, the second one is pretty much saying the same. An example of antithetical one is in Psalm 37. The wicked borrow and don't pay back, but the righteous are generous and keep on giving. For those blessed by the Lord shall inherit the land, but those cursed by him shall be cut off. This is clear antithetical comparison between the wicked and the righteous. An example of synthetic, blessed be the Lord, for he has heard the sound of my pleading. So the first line is blessed be the Lord. Why is the Lord blessed? Because the Lord hears the sound of prayers. So the second line here is giving a reason, giving an explanation. You see how this helps you to dig deeper into the text, because you start to ask, how are they related to each other? Psalm 119, how can young people keep their way pure? That's line A, asking a question, and line B is synthetic because it's giving an answer to that question. Psalm 31, I had said in my alarm, I am driven far from your sight. It's an introduction of a quotation. Line B is the actual quotation, synthetic. And so on. Those are kind of my responses. The last one is really interesting. As far as the east from the west, so far he removes our transgression from us. So I saw on Moodle, some of you put it as synthetic, others put it as synonymous. And I put both synthetic and synonymous because both are quite strong possibilities. There is clearly a comparison that is at play, so that's why they could be synonymous. But it's also synthetic because the second line of the first verse, verse 12, is actually adding something. They are not just about measuring the distance, they are about how, God deals with human sinfulness. As father or as parent has compassion for his children, so the Lord has compassion for those who fear him. This is clearly synonymous, but then it's synthetic in the sense that it's adding something about who are the children. Sometimes I also think that there might be going on a line, like a way, a parallelism going on, not just within the same Hebrew poetic line, but multiple lines where they are in some ways related. So, for example, I would think, and I might be wrong, that as far as the east from the west, so far he removes our transgression from us. This whole line with its two parts parallel the second verse, as a father or as a parent has compassion for her children, so the Lord has compassion for those who fear God. So in some ways that notion of comparison is synonymous. The reason I'm saying this synonymous or synthetic here is that sometimes this is open for interpretation. It's not a rocket science or something. Rocket science is can be hard. It's not like a biological lab where you test something and you always expect the same result. It's open to interpretation. It's dynamic. So now we go back to the PowerPoint because I want to say one important thing about metaphors. So, when you are thinking about metaphors, metaphors are powerful because they are giving a visual texture to the abstract concept. So, ask this question: what difference does it make? And instead of saying God cares about God's creation, to say God is a parent. What difference does it make when you call into a way of thinking about what it means to be human to say we are like grass? Yes, it's the same idea. We are fragile, but when you say we are grass, we are like grass, you're inviting people's imagination. You are not just hearing the poem, you are imagining it. You are drawn into its world by way of imagination and thinking. So metaphors produce something fresh. Metaphors carry over and transfer. And therefore, we think about tenor and vehicle. Tenor is the concept that you are trying to communicate, and the vehicle is the image that you are using in order to communicate that idea. Lots of metaphors used in the Bible for humans and for God: rock, fortress, refuge, stronghold, and so on. God as a ruler, because God judges, shepherd, farmer, warrior, builder, master and mistress, parent and nursing mother, father and nursing mother. Humans are like trees: palm, cedar, vine, olive, sheep, flock, worm, vultures, owl, lonely bird, deer looking for water, dry wineskin and broken pot, grass, flower, shadow, and so on. Metaphors work best when there is a grounded knowledge of both the tenor and the vehicle. Like when you can say, what does taking a refuge mean here? And why? Why does someone talk about fragility? And what is the vehicle? What is being communicated by using the image of an owl or a vulture? So how do I expand my knowledge about these things, these images, these vehicles, so that I would be able to interpret this text in a way that is deep, in a way that is grounded in its words? Therefore, we need to build our understanding of what the image or the metaphor meant for the first audience. The way you understand shepherd is different from how the ancient Easterners understood what shepherd is. The Lord is my shepherd is not just about God creating this serenity and this nice, calm place. It's actually a royal image. It's a royal metaphor in the ancient Near East. Therefore, it's used different times about God as a shepherd who is actually ruling over the people. It talks about the nature of the sovereignty and so on as a kind, caring kind of sovereignty. So how do we build our knowledge? You do research. Why talk about Siddur for human beings? When they were talking about owls, maybe you read Harry Potter and owls are great in Harry Potter, but that's not how they thought about owls. So you need to transfer to the world of the text and understand how they thought about these creatures and what they were trying to communicate. Therefore, we use lexicons, concordances, Bible dictionaries, geography, archaeology, and ancient Near Eastern texts in order to understand what they meant. I will finish with this quotation from Brown. It's how we interpret Psalms. Interpreting Psalms is about zooming in and zooming out, stepping back from examining individual poetic lines. This is what I am trying to get you to do when you do parallelisms, when you do metaphors. You are zooming in, you are working with details, word for word, image for image, line for line, and so on. But Brown is also inviting us to take a step back, to look at the whole poem. So stepping back from examining individual poetic lines to viewing individual psalms as whole entities, as networks of movement and meaning. But in doing so, may we never lose sight of the little elements and subtle relationships that make the Psalms what they are at the most fundamental level, poetry. So you work with the details, but you take a step back. How do they work together to create this poem? You look at the larger picture without losing those details. This is how you do a grounded interpretation of the Book of Psalms. Next week, we're going to learn another skill, and that skill is how the redactors of the Book of Psalms organize the Psalms. What's at stake in putting Psalm 43 after Psalm 42 and before Psalm 44? Is there a relationship or are they random? And that's the question that we will be talking about next week.